The call to adventure. The night was quiet, and the stars above shone brightly, twinkling in the endless black sky. Yet beneath this peaceful silence, a storm was brewing, a storm that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. The Human Relic Hunter, known as Cal, stood alone in the command room of his ship, the Vanguard. He gazed out into the abyss, deep in thought. His crew had long since fallen silent, retreating to their quarters after a long journey. But Cal wasn't tired. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a puzzle that had occupied his thoughts for days. He had been a relic hunter for years, traveling from one galaxy to the next, seeking out ancient artifacts of immense power. He'd explored ruins, discovered forgotten cities, and faced dangers that would have broken lesser men. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. A sudden beeping sound broke the stillness of the room. Cal's sharp eyes snapped to the console, his fingers quickly pressing the buttons to bring the message up on the screen. It was an encrypted transmission, a rare occurrence. Most messages were nothing more than routine communications, but this one had the distinct mark of something important, something urgent. Cal's curiosity was piqued. He had encountered encrypted messages before, but this one felt different. His hand hovered over the controls, but he hesitated. Was this a trap? A message from one of the many enemies he had made during his travels? Or was it something more? A call to adventure? The kind of mystery that had drawn him into this dangerous life in the first place. With a deep breath, Cal hit the decryption key. The screen flickered for a moment. Then the message appeared, written in an ancient language he instantly recognized. It was the language of the Valthorians, a long-extinct alien race. The Valthorians had been known for their advanced technology and powerful relics, but very little was known about them. Most of their history had been lost to time, buried in the ruins of their decimated empire. The message was short but clear. The relic is hidden. The final piece is yours. Find it before they do. Cal's pulse quickened. The relic. He had heard stories of it, whispered rumors in the corners of the galaxy. A weapon of unimaginable power, capable of altering the very fabric of reality. But no one had ever been able to confirm its existence. Some said it was a myth, a tale told to frighten the weak. But Cal knew better. Where there was smoke, there was fire. And this was no ordinary fire. It was a flame that could burn the galaxy itself. His mind raced as he processed the message. Who was they? And who was sending this message? The possibility of finding the relic was too tempting to ignore. Cal had always lived for the thrill of the hunt, the rush of discovery, and the challenge of surviving the impossible. But this was different. This wasn't just another artifact. It was the key to untold power, and it was calling to him. He glanced at the star map on his console. The coordinates were clear, an uncharted planet on the edge of the galaxy, a place that had never been explored by any living being. The Valthorians had once called it their home, but it had been abandoned centuries ago, left to decay in the cold darkness of space. Without a second thought, Cal ordered the ship's engines to power up. His crew might be resting now, but they would soon be waking up to a new mission, one that would take them to the very heart of the galaxy's mysteries. The Vanguard roared to life, its engines humming as it pulled away from the space station, where Cal had been docked for repairs. The stars outside blurred into streaks of light as the ship jumped into hyperspace, its destination set. As the ship sailed through the vast emptiness of space, Cal couldn't help but feel the weight of the mission ahead of him. This wouldn't be like any other hunt. This would be the final hunt, the one that would define his legacy as a relic hunter. The one that would either make him a legend or destroy him completely. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, as the ship traveled deeper into the unknown. The hunt for the Valthorian relic had begun, and Cal was ready. But little did he know, there were others out there, tracking him in the shadows. Enemies who would stop at nothing to claim the power of the relic for themselves. The adventure was just beginning, and already, Cal could feel the storm of danger approaching. Entering the Forbidden Zone. The Vanguard slipped through the void of space like a silent predator. Cale sat in the cockpit, his eyes focused on the star chart before him, watching as the uncharted planet slowly came into view. The coordinates had led him to a place where no human had set foot, a place surrounded by myths and warnings. He knew that what awaited him on the surface could be more than just a challenge. It could be a death sentence, but that only made the mission more thrilling. He adjusted the ship's controls and punched in the landing sequence. The atmosphere outside was thick with the dust of forgotten centuries, and the planet itself was barely visible through the thick clouds that swirled across its surface. The storm that raged across the sky would make a landing difficult, but Cale had always prided himself on his ability to handle the most dangerous situations. This was no different. The ground shook beneath them as the ship descended, a low rumble that Cale could feel in his bones. The storm outside whipped the ship's hull, making the ship groan under the pressure, but Cale remained calm, his hands steady on the controls. The harsh winds and shifting clouds outside made it nearly impossible to see, but the scanner systems on the Vanguard gave him everything he needed. Finally, with a soft jolt, the ship touched down. Cale released the landing gear and powered down the engines. The storm outside howled as if warning him to leave, but Cale knew better. He had come too far to turn back now. He quickly suited up in his tactical gear, making sure his weapons were secured and his tools were ready. The airlock hissed open, and a gust of cold, damp air rushed into the cabin. Cale took a deep breath, feeling the strange chill in his lungs. The planet's atmosphere was harsh, but it wasn't the environment that worried him. It was what lay beneath the surface. The ruins were just ahead, hidden deep within the planet's rocky terrain. They were ancient, forgotten by time, but not by danger. Cale stepped onto the barren land, his boots crunching against the rocky soil. The storm raged around him, thick clouds of dust swirling in every direction. The eerie silence of the planet pressed against his ears, making the howling winds sound like distant whispers. He didn't waste time. The relic was out there, and he was determined to find it. His boots carried him forward as he made his way toward the ruins. The landscape around him was desolate, a wasteland of cracked earth and twisted rock formations. It was hard to believe anything had ever lived here, but the ruins ahead told a different story. The stone structures were massive, towering above him, their sharp angles and strange designs marking them as the work of a civilization far beyond anything humans had achieved. As Cale approached the entrance, he noticed something odd. Symbols carved into the rock, symbols that seemed to glow faintly, even in the dark storm. He had seen these before in ancient texts, the markings of the Valforians. They were warnings, signs meant to deter anyone from entering the sacred grounds. But Cale wasn't deterred. He had faced worse. The entrance to the temple was hidden behind a thick wall of stone, but Cale's sharp eyes spotted the faint outline of a door. Using his tools, he began to carefully carve away at the stone, his mind racing with thoughts of the artifact that lay hidden inside. Every second spent working on the entrance felt like an eternity, and the storm outside seemed to grow more violent with each passing minute. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage leading into the heart of the ruin. Cale entered, feeling the strange sense of foreboding wash over him. The temperature inside was noticeably cooler, and the air was stale, as if no one had set foot here in centuries. But Cale didn't hesitate. He stepped deeper into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the blackness. The walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, and strange carvings of alien figures adorned the stone. The place was unlike anything he had ever seen before, ancient and alien, yet beautiful in its design. Cale moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The deeper he went, the more intense the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't just the strange carvings on the walls. It was something else, something intangible, but undeniable. He was not alone. As he rounded a corner, a loud, metallic screech echoed through the halls. Cale's heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively reached for his blaster. He wasn't alone, and whatever it was close. The silence was shattered by the sound of something heavy moving in the shadows. Kel's pulse quickened. Was it just a trick of the wind, or had he triggered some ancient mechanism? A low growl broke through the silence. The danger was real. Something in this ancient temple was alive, and it was coming for him. Kel drew his weapon and prepared for whatever came next, knowing that there would be no turning back. The ancient ruins. The deeper Kel ventured into the ruin, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him stretched longer, curling as if they were alive. The walls of the temple were covered in intricate alien symbols, their meanings lost to time. Kel ran his fingers over the smooth stone, his mind racing as he tried to decipher the markings. He had spent years studying alien languages, but these symbols were unlike anything he had encountered before. The corridor he followed led into a vast chamber. The walls were lined with large stone pillars, each engraved with mysterious inscriptions. In the center of the room stood a massive altar, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs, untouched for centuries. Kel's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. But as he approached the altar, something strange happened. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, and the walls of the chamber groaned. A deep rumble echoed through the temple, as if the entire structure was alive. Kel quickly drew his blaster, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. Then a series of mechanical sounds filled the air, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing the hidden passage. Kel's heart raced as he moved toward the new opening, instinct telling him that this was the way forward. He knew there was no turning back now. As he moved through the narrow passage, he noticed something strange. The walls were lined with old technology, strange devices embedded in the stone. Some of them hummed softly, emitting faint glows of blue light. Kel couldn't help but marvel at the advanced engineering. These machines had been built long before humans had even mastered space travel. The Valthorians were more advanced than anyone had ever imagined. The passage finally opened into a large chamber, its ceiling towering high above. In the center of the room lay the object Kel had been hunting for, the Valthorian relic. It was a large crystalline structure, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The relic was encased in a field of energy, a protective barrier that hummed with power. Kel could feel the energy radiating from it, a force so strong it made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He approached the relic carefully, his eyes fixed on it. The temptation to take it, to claim it for himself, was almost overwhelming. But Kel had learned long ago that greed had no place in his line of work. The artifact had to be handled with care. It was clear that the relic was more than just a weapon. It was a key to something far greater than Kel could understand. Just as Kel reached out to touch the energy field surrounding the relic, a low voice echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down his spine. "Do not touch it." Kel's hand froze midair. He spun around, his weapon raised, but there was no one there. The voice had come from nowhere, and yet it was clear and unmistakable. It had come from within the walls of the temple, as if the ruin itself was speaking to him. The air grew heavy with tension, and Kel's instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. Slowly, he lowered his weapon and took a step back, his eyes darting around the chamber, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the faint hum of the energy field protecting the relic. "What do you want?" Kel asked aloud, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The voice had warned him, but what did it mean? Was this a test, or a trap? The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. The atmosphere in the room was thick, oppressive, as though the very air was charged with anticipation. Kel had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This was something ancient, something that even the most experienced hunters would fear. And then, as if responding to his question, the voice spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Leave this place. The The relic is not meant for your kind. Cal's eyes narrowed. Who are you? There was a pause, followed by a soft sigh that seemed to come from all around him. We are the guardians of the Valthorian legacy, the voice said. We have waited for centuries to protect this relic from those who seek to misuse it. You do not understand the power you seek to wield. Cal's grip on his blaster tightened. He didn't know who or what was speaking to him, but he knew one thing for certain. The relic had power beyond his understanding, and whoever, or whatever, was guarding it was willing to do anything to keep it hidden. I'm not here to misuse it, Cal said, his voice firm. I only want to learn. I want to understand. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't as oppressive. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change that Cal couldn't quite explain. The voice spoke again, but this time it was less hostile. You seek knowledge, it said. Then prove yourself worthy. Before Cal could respond, the ground beneath his feet trembled again. The energy field around the relic flickered, and the stone walls of the chamber began to shift. The temple was alive, reacting to Cal's presence, testing him. Cal took a deep breath and steadied himself. This was it, the test he had been waiting for. Whatever challenge lay ahead, he was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. Uncovering dark secrets. The walls of the chamber groaned again, the sound of ancient mechanisms grinding to life. The energy field surrounding the relic flickered one last time, then stabilized, its glow pulsating in rhythm with Cal's heartbeat. The voice that had warned him now lingered in the air, and Cal knew that whatever came next would shape the future of the galaxy. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving the relic. The voice had promised him a test, and Cal was ready. He'd faced countless dangers in his career, but this was different. The relic wasn't just another artifact. It was the key to something far greater, something the galaxy had forgotten. The chamber itself was shifting now, almost as though it were alive, responding to Cal's every move. The walls cracked open in places, revealing hidden passages and chambers beyond. Strange symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, filling the room with a faint, eerie light. Cal knew there was more to this place than met the eye. The relic was important, but there was something more, the truth hidden within the ruins of the Valthorians. His mind raced. The Guardians hadn't just warned him about the power of the relic. They had warned him about something darker, something that lay buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As he moved toward the relic, a low hum filled the chamber. The voice spoke again, but this time it was different. There was no threat in its tone, only a sense of sadness. You are close, Hunter. The truth you seek lies beneath the relic. But beware, the path you choose will change everything. Cal hesitated. What did the voice mean? What truth lay beneath the relic? He had come for the artifact, but now he wondered if the journey was leading him to something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Without another word, Cal carefully stepped forward, placing his hand on the energy field that encased the relic. His skin tingled at the contact, and the field seemed to respond to his touch, vibrating under his palm. He could feel the power within it, a force that called to him, urging him to take it. But something inside him hesitated. The Guardians had warned him that the relic was not meant for humans. What was the true nature of the power it held? And what was the cost of claiming it? The hum of the chamber grew louder, and a low, rumbling sound echoed from deep within the temple. The ground trembled, and Cal's heart raced. He knew something was coming, something far more dangerous than the relic itself. The temple was alive, and it was testing him. Cal stepped back, his eyes scanning the chamber. The voice spoke once more, its tone cold and distant. You do not understand, Hunter. The relic is not merely a weapon. It is a doorway to the past, to the Valthorian Empire. It holds the power to unlock their greatest secrets, but it also holds their darkest curse. The air around Cal grew heavy, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with the relic's energy. The walls trembled, and for the first time, Kale felt the full weight of the temple's history pressing down on him. This was no ordinary artifact. It was the key to a civilization's rise and fall. "You must decide," the voice said, its tone echoing through the chamber. "Will you take the relic and risk unleashing the curse of the Valforians? Or will you leave it behind and let the past remain buried?" Cal's mind raced as the room seemed to close in around him. The voice's warning weighed heavily on him, but the allure of the relic was impossible to ignore. The Valforians had been a mighty empire, but they had vanished. What had caused their downfall? What had they discovered that led to their destruction? The answers were within his grasp, but at what cost? Cal's fingers hovered above the relic's energy field. His heart pounded in his chest as the fate of the galaxy seemed to hang in the balance. The power to change everything was within his reach. But the voice had spoken of a curse, a dark force that could destroy everything Cal had worked for. Could he really risk it? For a moment, the chamber fell silent. Cal stood still, his hand trembling as he made his decision. "I will take the relic," he said, his voice firm. "I will unlock its secrets." The moment his words left his mouth, the room erupted in a burst of energy. The ground shook violently, and the air crackled with the raw power of the relic. The energy field surrounding it shattered, sending a blinding light across the room. Cal raised his hand to shield his eyes as the light intensified. The chamber seemed to collapse around him, the walls cracking and crumbling. But he didn't flinch. The relic was his now. Whatever came next, he was ready. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the chamber as a massive stone door slammed shut behind him, trapping Cal inside. The light from the relic flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the light finally returned, Cal found himself standing in a new chamber, one that was completely different from the one he had just left. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. And at the center of the room, there was something Cal had not expected. A hologram flickered to life, revealing an image of an ancient Valforian. The figure was tall, with glowing eyes and a regal presence. It spoke in a language Cal couldn't understand, but its meaning was clear. This was the last Valforian, and it had left a message for anyone who dared to find the relic. The hologram flickered again, and Cal realized that he was no longer just a hunter of relics. He was now part of something far greater. The truth of the Valforians, their rise and their fall, was now in his hands. But as the hologram spoke, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that he had just unleashed something far darker than he could ever imagine. The rival hunter. Cal stood frozen, staring at the flickering hologram of the last Valforian. The room was thick with tension as the figure spoke in ancient Valforian, its words indecipherable, but its meaning clear. This was not just another relic. It was a key to the Valforian legacy. The power that had once made their empire unstoppable was now within Cal's grasp. But as the hologram's image shimmered and faded, Cal's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, reached Cal's ears. Footsteps. Slowly, cautiously, Cal turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The cold gleam of his blaster was comforting, but he knew that whoever was here, they weren't just another wanderer lost in the ruins. No, this was a hunter, just like him. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and lean, her eyes hidden behind the dark visor of a helmet. Her armor was marked with the insignia of a mercenary group known across the galaxy for taking on the most dangerous jobs. The bounty hunter, Astrid, was infamous for her ruthlessness and her obsession with relics, especially the ones with untold power. Cal's hand tightened around the grip of his blaster. He had heard rumors of her, but he hadn't expected to run into her here, in the heart of Valforian ruins. She was dangerous, and he knew she wasn't here to share the relic. She wanted it, just like he did. Astrid's helmet tilted slightly, as if sizing him up. "I should have known it would be you," she said, her voice cold and calculating. The legendary Human Relic Hunter, always one step ahead, always digging for things best left buried. Cal's jaw tightened. You should have stayed away, Astrid. This relic is mine. A low chuckle escaped her lips. You really think you can keep it? Do you know what you're dealing with? This isn't just an artifact. It's the key to something much more dangerous than you realize. You're in over your head, Cal. Cal's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He knew she was right about one thing. This relic was far more powerful than he had anticipated. But it was also the very reason he had come. No one else could have it, especially not someone like her. Astrid took a step closer, her movements fluid and predatory. The Valforians built this temple for a reason. They knew that one day someone would come for this relic, and they knew that the last piece of their power would lead to their destruction. You think you're the one to unlock it. You think you can control it. Cal stepped forward, his stance firm. I didn't come here to play games, Astrid. The relic is a part of something bigger. If we don't unlock its secrets, the galaxy will pay the price. She stopped in her tracks, her helmet tilting as if considering his words. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the relic's energy field. Then, Astrid's lips curled into a smirk. You're not the only one after this power, Cal. You might be the first, but you won't be the last. She reached for the weapon on her hip, drawing a sleek, silver pistol. The glint of the barrel was unmistakable. Cal's hand went to his own blaster, but he didn't draw it just yet. He knew better. This was no ordinary confrontation. Astrid wasn't just a rival. She was a professional, and she had likely prepared for this moment long before Cal ever stepped foot on this planet. Give it to me, Cal, Astrid demanded, her voice cold. I don't want to kill you, but if you make me, I will. Cal's fingers hovered near the trigger, his mind racing. He couldn't let her take the relic. He had come too far, uncovered too many secrets to turn back now. But he also knew that Astrid wasn't one to back down. She was too clever, too dangerous, and she had no loyalty to anything but power. Before Cal could respond, there was a sudden, sharp sound, a low whirring, like something powering up. Both Cal and Astrid froze, their eyes darting around the room. The relic, now fully exposed, seemed to pulse with an increased intensity. The room's walls began to shake, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The voice of the Valforian echoed again, reverberating through the chamber. You have disturbed the balance. The voice boomed. You are not worthy. You do not understand what you have awakened. The relic's light flickered, and the chamber began to glow with a strange ethereal energy. The stone floor cracked open beneath them, and Cal stumbled, trying to maintain his footing. Astrid's eyes widened in realization. This is what I was afraid of, she muttered, her voice laced with fear. The ground shook violently now, and pieces of the ceiling began to crumble. The walls of the temple seemed to close in, and the very air grew thick with tension. Cal stood up, his blaster still aimed at Astrid. But now, the real threat wasn't her. It was the relic, and the power it had unleashed. The temple was collapsing, and both of them were trapped. Looks like we're both in over our heads now, Cal said, his voice grim. We need to get out of here. Astrid's gaze flickered between the relic and Cal, her face hidden behind the helmet, but her body language told him everything he needed to know. She knew the danger they were in, and for a split second, there was no rivalry, no animosity. They were simply two people fighting to survive. After you, Astrid said, backing away from the relic and toward the crumbling exit. Cal didn't hesitate. Together, they made a break for the door, their footsteps echoing in the vast, crumbling temple. The ground continued to shake, and the air was thick with the sound of ancient stone falling apart. As they sprinted through the darkened corridors, Cal could feel the weight of the relic's power closing in around them. Whatever curse or legacy the Valforians had left behind, it was waking up now. And they were both caught in the middle of it. The temple wasn't just a relic of the past anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, and Kel had no idea how long they had before it was too late. The final battle. The ground shook beneath Kel's feet as he sprinted through the crumbling corridors, his heart pounding in his chest. The ancient Valforian temple was no longer just a ruin. It was coming to life, triggered by the relic's power. The walls cracked, and the floor seemed to tremble with every step. Dust and debris rained down from above, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. Kel could hear Astrid's footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. Their only goal was to survive. The exit was just ahead, but the path to it was filled with peril. A series of energy barriers had suddenly activated, casting red, dangerous light across the hallway, blocking the way. "Get down," Astrid shouted, pulling Kel out of the way just as a pulse of energy shot through the air. The blast hit the wall behind them, sending a shower of sparks and stone flying in all directions. They dove for cover behind a nearby pillar as the energy continued to fire from hidden turrets above. Kel's breath came in ragged gasps. They couldn't keep this up forever. The temple's defenses were far from dormant. They were actively trying to destroy everything that dared enter. "We need to disable these," Kel muttered, eyeing the control panels embedded in the walls. "If we don't, we won't make it out alive." Astrid crouched beside him, already scanning the control panel. "I know how to disable them. Keep them distracted. I'll handle this." Kel nodded, knowing the risks. The turrets would keep firing if they were not deactivated, and there was no way to outrun them in the narrow hallways of the collapsing temple. He glanced at Astrid for a moment. Though they were enemies, they had a common goal now: survival. Without warning, Kel leaped out from behind the pillar, firing his blaster at one of the turrets above them. His shots were precise, taking down the nearest turret, but more began to emerge from hidden alcoves, and the air was filled with the sound of whirring and laser blasts. Astrid worked quickly, using her expertise to hack into the panel. "Almost there," she shouted, her fingers flying over the console as she bypassed the temple's ancient security systems. Kel kept moving, his eyes scanning for any new threats, but the turrets were relentless. Another shot grazed his shoulder, sending a sharp pain through his arm, but he didn't falter. He gritted his teeth and kept fighting, pushing through the pain. "Done." Astrid's voice cut through the chaos, and a moment later, the energy barriers powered down, and the turrets stopped firing. Kel exhaled a sharp breath, relieved but not yet safe. "Let's move." He sprinted toward the exit, with Astrid right behind him. The hallway ahead was still crumbling, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel. They had to make it before the entire structure came down. The walls of the temple were crumbling, and Kel could hear the sound of stone cracking and shifting, as though the very bones of the structure were collapsing around them. They rounded a corner, and Kel saw the entrance up ahead, a doorway leading outside, where the storm still raged in the sky. But before they could reach it, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, sending them both tumbling into a dark pit. Kel landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him. He rolled to the side just in time to avoid a falling piece of stone that crashed down where he had been lying. The chamber they had fallen into was dark, and the air smelled of ancient decay. There was no time to waste. "Are you okay?" Astrid's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. Her helmet was cracked, and she had a cut across her cheek, but she seemed to be unharmed. Kel stood quickly, brushing the dust off himself. "Yeah, let's go." They both scrambled to their feet, and Kel's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light. The chamber they had fallen into was vast, its walls lined with broken statues and alien carvings. But in the center of the room, something was different, something that pulsed with a dark energy. Kel's heart raced as he approached the center of the room. There, glowing faintly, was another relic, the core of the Valforian power. It was the heart of the Empire, and it was pulsing with dark energy. "This is it," Kel whispered, his hand hovering over the relic. But as he moved closer, A voice boomed from the walls of the chamber. "You have come too far." The voice was cold, alien, and full of wrath. The ground beneath Cal's feet trembled once more, and the chamber began to shift. Suddenly, the walls of the room cracked open, revealing a horde of Valthorian defense drones, mechanical warriors designed to protect the Empire's most sacred treasures. Cal quickly drew his blaster, but there were too many of them. The drones moved in, their red eyes glowing with a deadly intent. Without hesitation, Cal opened fire, taking down the first few, but more kept coming, emerging from the shadows. The sound of metal clashing and energy blasts filled the room as the battle began in earnest. Astrid joined in, firing her weapon at the advancing drones, but it was clear that they were outnumbered. Cal had to think fast. The relic was the key, but the price of unlocking its power was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. A Valthorian drone lunged at Cal, knocking his blaster from his hand and sending him crashing to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a nearby shard of stone to use as a weapon. As the drone closed in, Cal thrust the stone into its weak spot, disabling it just in time. But it wasn't over. The relic, the true heart of the Valthorian Empire, was still pulsing with energy, and Cal knew that if it wasn't stopped soon, the entire planet could be destroyed. He had to make a choice: destroy the relic and risk losing everything, or take control of its power and face the consequences. The battle raged on, but Cal could feel the relic calling to him, urging him to unlock its secrets. But as the walls around him continued to crumble, he realized that time was running out. The legacy of the Relic Hunter. The battle seemed endless. Cal's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. The Valthorian defense drones were relentless, their mechanical bodies immune to most conventional weapons. Cal ducked behind a crumbling pillar, taking a moment to catch his breath. He had barely managed to disable one of the drones when another one closed in, its glowing red eyes scanning the dark chamber for movement. Astrid was still fighting, her weapons firing in rapid succession, but it was clear they were outmatched. The drones seemed to keep coming, no matter how many they destroyed. Cal's mind raced as he searched for a solution. He had to get to the relic, the heart of the Valthorian power, before it was too late. Glancing at the glowing relic in the center of the room, Cal realized something. The energy pulsing from it wasn't just a weapon, it was a beacon, drawing the drones to it. If they could destroy the source of the power, they could stop the drones and the temple's collapse. But the relic was no ordinary artifact. It was a part of something much greater, something Cal had barely begun to understand. The Valthorians had built their empire on this power, and now it was within his reach. Cal's eyes met Astrid's as they fought side by side. Her expression was determined, but it was clear that she, too, was running out of options. "Cal," she shouted over the chaos, ducking behind cover as a drone's laser narrowly missed her. "We need to destroy it. Now." He nodded, his decision made. If they didn't act quickly, they would both be trapped in this tomb, along with the secrets of the Valthorians. The galaxy couldn't afford to let the relic fall into the wrong hands, especially not into theirs. Cal ran toward the relic, dodging lasers and collapsing walls as the temple continued to fall apart around him. The drones were focused on them, leaving the relic momentarily unguarded. He reached it just as the ground cracked beneath his feet, the pulse of the energy field intensifying with each passing second. He knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, Cal drew his remaining weapon, a charged explosive device he had been carrying for emergencies. The weapon wasn't meant for this kind of task, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He knew it could destroy the relic, but it would also destroy the entire chamber and everything else in its path. Astrid's voice came from behind him, urgent. "Cal, no. You don't know what'll happen if you destroy it. We might all." But Cal didn't wait for her to finish. He slammed the device into the base of the relic and activated it, knowing the consequences of his choice. The energy surrounding the relic fluctuated, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The drone stopped moving. The rumbling of the temple ceased. Kel's heart skipped a beat, and he turned just in time to see Astrid's face flash with concern. She had seen it too. The relic's power was beginning to react. The light around it intensified, brighter than the sun, as the energy surged to uncontrollable levels. Then, without warning, the explosion ripped through the chamber. Kale was thrown back by the shockwave, his body slamming into the stone wall. The world spun around him, and his vision blurred as the force of the blast threw him into unconsciousness. When Kale awoke, he was lying on the cold, cracked floor of the chamber. The air was thick with dust, and the sounds of the collapsing temple had quieted. Slowly, he sat up, wincing from the pain that shot through his body. His ears rang, and his head felt heavy. But there was something else, a sense of stillness, a calm that was almost unnatural. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and then froze. The relic was gone. All that remained was a crater where the relic had once stood, the stone floor shattered and scorched. The air around him hummed with residual energy, but the oppressive presence of the relic was no longer there. Kel's pulse quickened as he stood, his legs shaky beneath him. "Kel, you did it," Astrid's voice called from behind him. She was standing at the entrance of the chamber, her helmet now off, revealing a face covered in dirt and cuts, but still alive. She had made it. Kale turned, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The tension between them, the rivalry, the danger, all seemed to vanish in the face of what they had just done. They had destroyed the relic, the key to the Valforian power, and with it, the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. But something still lingered in the air, something Kale couldn't quite place. "Astrid," Kale said, his voice hoarse. "What now? What happens to us, to the galaxy?" Astrid stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "We leave this place behind, Kale. The Valforians are gone, their empire lost. But we still have our lives. And maybe that's enough for now." Kale glanced around the destroyed chamber one last time. The walls had crumbled, and the ceiling was nearly gone. But despite the ruin, there was a sense of finality in the air. The relic was no more, and with it, the power that could have rewritten history. For a moment, Kale felt as if the weight of the entire galaxy had been lifted from his shoulders. But he knew the truth. There were always more relics, more artifacts, and more dangers waiting in the galaxy. The adventure never truly ended for someone like him. "We can't stop now," Kale said, turning to face Astrid. "The hunt is still out there." Astrid nodded slowly. "I suppose it is. And we're both still standing." Together, they made their way toward the exit, leaving the ruined Valforian temple behind. The storm outside had calmed, and the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The relic hunter's journey would continue, and this time, Kale knew that no matter what happened, the galaxy would never be the same. The legacy of the Valforians had ended, but the legacy of the human relic hunter had only just begun.